Someone make it make sense.
I'll be a couple.
Hello, squirrel friends. So welcome to this live stream. I'm really excited for some of the things we're going to talk about today. The theme of today is Delphi and Karen Reed. So two cases that have a lot in common, and we're going to talk about that. And both cases, trials, which had surprising results for many of us. And, you know, of course, Karen Reed resulting in a mistrial. The surprise there being that, you know, from what we know, potentially they would have acquitted her on the second-degree murder charge, but still surprising that potentially they were considering the lesser includeds, from what we know. And of course, with Richard Allen being found guilty and convicted. So it's interesting to think about these two cases because there's a lot of similarities from start to finish. Like when you think about just from the beginning of the investigation, right? Looking at the investigation. So in both cases, you had, you know, questionable police work. That's putting it mildly, kindly. You know, I would say extremely questionable in both cases, right? You had a lot of suspects, right? A lot of potential suspects. However, in both cases, only one person was really zoomed in on, right? And focused on for the being charged. You know, you also had both suspects maintaining their innocence in both cases. And I'm trying to think, there were some other similarities as well in terms of just the investigative process. And let me know if you guys think of any other commonalities there. You also had two individuals who didn't have any prior criminal record, for another thing. And then as it goes to trial, right, you had both cases where they have strong defense attorneys who wanted to present a third-party strategy, right? And of course, in both cases, you had judges who were very, very prosecution-leaning and didn't allow a lot of that evidence in, as we know. A lot of really questionable rulings made during trial and pre-trial by the judges in both cases. And the other thing that was interesting too is I remember with the reportings that were coming out of Delphi from people in the courtroom, I remember getting that same feeling that I had in Karen Reed, where it felt like there were people who were on the stand testifying, like as witnesses for the prosecution, where it felt like they were the ones really on trial. So like, for example, with Karen Reed, right, we had all of the McAlberts, right, and Brian Higgins and everything. And it was like, it felt like it was like their trial a lot of times. You know, there were many periods of time where Karen Reed and John O'Keefe weren't even mentioned. And then similarly in Delphi, for example, when you had Brad Weber on the stand, and then like Sergeant, I think he's a sergeant, but Mullins, you know, him, and then also the, you know, there were just different law enforcement officers, similar thing, right? Where it felt like they were the ones on trial or should have been, right? Shout out to Abby Gist. Glad to see you, my friend. And I'm glad that you are everything that you shared in the Discord. Thank you for that. That was really inspiring to read. So of course, whenever we are opening ourselves up to others and helping them in the way that you are, of course, we always end up getting more than we give. And that's the great thing about being so compassionate, right? So I'm just so glad to hear that your situation has vastly improved. It sounds like that's awesome. So, you know, but it was just interesting seeing the similarities with those witnesses where it felt like they were the ones who really were kind of, you know, should have been defendants potentially, right? Or at least like they were on trial to a certain extent. And you had, in both cases, you had the defense attorneys completely obliterating the prosecution's case. I mean, it seemed like in both cases, right? To me, it seemed like open and shut, not guilty for everybody on all the counts, like for Karen Reed, for all of her counts. Same with Richard Allen. It seemed like acquittals were just obvious, right? And it's interesting too, because, you know, for those of you guys who've been following the Casey Anthony trial series that I've been covering, gavel to gavel, you know, the theme of that and what inspired me to want to cover that was, you know, did the jury get it wrong? Because that case is infamous, right? And for this, you know, most gay woman in America. I've even mentioned how even whenever you go to a live stream for any trial anywhere, Casey Anthony's name always comes up. And in fact, let me actually pull this up. Hold on just a second, because I actually had, if I saved it, let me see if I saved it. I actually had saved a screenshot of the exact thing I'm mentioning here that is really crazy to me. So let me just see if I can find this real quick. There we go. There it is. Okay, can you guys see this? So this was waiting for the verdict in Richard Allen's trial. And this was me trying to just pull up a feed because I was considering streaming the verdict, and then that didn't happen, but whatever. Anyway, but this was just the local news channel or whatever. And look at this in the chat. It's highlighted here. So somebody says, and it's not on topic, right? We're talking about Richard Allen here, or they should be. But this says, Casey Anthony was and still is guilty AF. Hate that woman. And this is just an example of what I see all the time. And the thing that's so interesting is that these people never watched, to my knowledge, for anyone I've talked to about this, they never watched the trial gavel to gavel, or maybe they saw parts of it, or they didn't see any of it. They just saw Nancy Grace. I've only so far come across one person who actually did watch the entire trial gavel to gavel at the time, and they said for sure it was an acquittal and not guilty for sure. So, so it's just interesting because so in other words, you know, because I have so much faith in the juries, right? And that's what's been so difficult with like Karen Reed and Richard Allen. So, but by going through the Casey Anthony trial, you know, and actually watching it, then in my opinion, so far, it's really been super clear. You know, we're still in the state's case in chief, but so far it's very clear why the jury acquitted her. And I don't have any questions about that at this juncture. It's similarly to Karen Reed and Richard Allen, where the entire time the defense is making every single witness a witness for the defense. It's like every single person. And another similarity too, just like I said, where it feels like somebody else should be on trial, George Anthony on the stand, Cindy Anthony on the stand, and Lee Anthony on the stand. It's the same feeling where you're like, this seems like they should be the ones on trial here. So, and of course that resulted in, and she was acquitted, right? So what's different? What's different? So this is the thing, right? So what's different between like the Casey Anthony trial where she was acquitted, despite this is what's so crazy, right? Everyone thought she was guilty, right, in the terms of the public opinion, but she was acquitted. Then you have Karen Reed and Richard Allen, where a lot of people think they're factually innocent, or at the very least should have been found not guilty. And in those cases, you have a mistrial and a guilty verdict, right? So how does this happen when you've got such strong cases, right? So for that, we are going to look to jury instructions, because I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about, again, if you objectively look at the state's case, the shoddy investigation, the fact that they didn't look at other suspects, and then you look at the strong cross-examinations done by the defense teams and the very strong cases in chief by the defense when it was their respective turns, and you look at all that, you look at it objectively. I mean, I find it difficult for anyone to really be, if they're being honest with themselves, in both Karen Reed and in Richard Allen, I find it difficult to believe if someone's being truly honest with themselves for them to say objectively, factually, the state met their burden in either case. I really firmly feel like the people who say that state did meet their burden, I think these were people who were probably in the guilty camp before trial because they just want the person to be guilty, right? And then they back that up by saying that the state met their burden, because everybody knows if you're watching trials, you should leave opinions out of it and go off of the evidence presented at trial, right? But if you still have that opinion and you want to support it, you could just say like, yeah, the state met their burden, right? But I feel like if you're being honest with yourselves, if they're being honest with themselves, how can you actually say that, like legitimately just looking at the evidence presented at trial? So when you keep that in mind, right, when you think of it that way, you think about the evidence and you think about the issues in both cases, and just there's for those of us, right? What is it that we always say? For those of us who are following these cases, the thing that everyone kept saying, and thinking, and including myself, is that all there is reasonable doubt, right? All there is reasonable doubt. So when it comes to a jury and they're being read their jury instructions and they're going into deliberations, that's the standard, right? That's the burden of proof, is reasonable doubt. So that's why we're looking to the jury instructions, because there is an anomaly in both Massachusetts and in Indiana as it pertains to the jury instructions and how they handle reasonable doubt. And those anomalies are different from other states. For example, Florida, right? So when we think about, again, the jury acquitting Casey Anthony, but yet mistrial for Karen Reed and a conviction in Richard Allen. So we're going to look to jury instructions. And I think this is going to shed a little bit of light on, remember, again, looking at the way that the evidence came in, right? Well, this instruction for a jury is the lens through which they view that evidence, right? So if depending on how that is handled with reasonable doubt in the jury instructions, that's the entire thing. That's the entire reason we have a trial. Is there reasonable doubt? Yes or no? That's the whole thing. And so the way that's handled really matters. So first, we're going to take a look at the North Carolina jury instructions. These are from the pattern jury instructions. So this is burden of proof and reasonable doubt. So let's take a look. The defendant has entered a plea of not guilty. The fact that the defendant has been indicted or charged, right, is no evidence of guilt. Under our system of justice, when a defendant pleads not guilty, the defendant is not required to prove the defendant's innocence. The defendant is presumed to be innocent. As Judge Newman would say, they're shielded with a cloak of righteousness or something like that, right? The state must prove to you that the defendant is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And then here we go. A reasonable doubt is a doubt based on reason and common sense, arising out of some or all of the evidence that has been presented, or lack or sufficiency of the evidence, as the case may be. Proof beyond a reasonable doubt is proof that fully satisfies or entirely convinces you of the defendant's guilt. And there's a footnote. Reasonable doubt need be defined only if specifically requested. So they don't have to define it, but they can. That's North Carolina. Is there anything else on this page? No. Okay, that's North Carolina. And I would say that in every trial it's requested. Okay, so next we're going to look at, so that's North Carolina. Now we're going to look at Florida, right? And we heard these just recently. Those of us who were watching Sarah Boone, we heard it. And it was interesting because we heard the thing about, an imaginary doubt, a fleeting doubt. And it was really more descriptive than what we hear oftentimes in other states or other trials. But that's actually in the jury instructions. So we're going to take a look at that. All righty. So this is Florida. All right. So remember, if you apply these jury instructions for Casey Anthony or any trial in Florida, but Casey Anthony being that she was acquitted, and keeping in mind we have all these same similarities, right? We have, I would say, the investigation in terms of the forensics and stuff in Casey Anthony did not have as many problems as in Delphi or Karen Reed. It was pretty good. There were a couple issues, but overall they didn't really have much there. But there were myriad other issues. But I would say that in terms of like the issues in the state's case in chief, I would say that Karen Reed and Delphi had far more issues than even in Casey Anthony. But again, that's why this part matters, because despite that, like, the defense in Casey Anthony's trial was able to show, they had reasonable doubt. They did not find her guilty. They acquitted her. So, okay. So thinking about that, this is the lens through which the jury deliberating for Casey Anthony or any other Florida trial, this is how they're going to this is the lens through which they view the evidence. The defendant has entered a plea of not guilty. This means you must presume or believe the defendant is innocent. This presumption stays with the defendant as to each material allegation through each stage of the trial, unless it has been overcome by the evidence to the exclusion of and beyond a reasonable doubt. That already is stronger language, in my opinion, in the North Carolina jury instruction. To overcome the defendant's presumption of innocence. Again, this is really strong language. I think that's great. The state has the burden of proving the crime with which the defendant is charged was committed, and the defendant is the person who committed the crime. The defendant is not required to present any evidence. We know that. So whenever the words reasonable doubt are used, you must consider the following. Proof beyond a reasonable doubt does not mean proof beyond all doubt. A reason, and this is exactly what we heard in Sarah Boone, a reasonable doubt is not a mere possible doubt, a speculative, imaginary, or forced doubt. Such a doubt must not influence you to return a verdict of not guilty if you have an abiding conviction of guilt. On the other hand, if, after carefully considering, comparing, and weighing all the evidence, there is not an abiding conviction of guilt, or if having a conviction, it is one which is not stable, but one which wavers and vacillates, then the charge is not proved beyond every reasonable doubt, and you must find the defendant not guilty because the doubt is reasonable. I think this is so well put, and it looks like this comes from State v. Wilson, and that's Florida case law from 1996. And then it further says, right, a reasonable doubt as to the guilt of the defendant may arise from the evidence, conflict in the evidence, or lack of evidence. Right here, conflict in the evidence. Dude, that right there, that's why this instruction is so important, because a conflict in the evidence, that changes things. Because I could see somebody going along with this paragraph here, right? And they could still feel like, yeah, I don't have a reasonable doubt. But then with this specific part here about a conflict in the evidence, that might be something that they hadn't considered. But now if you consider that, so many times in trials, right, we see conflicts in the evidence. And boy, oh boy, do we see that in Casey Anthony and Richard Allen and Karen Reed, conflicts in the evidence. Or the lack of evidence. Also lack of evidence, applicable for Casey Anthony, Karen Reed, and Richard Allen. If you have a reasonable doubt, you should find the defendant not guilty. If you have no reasonable doubt, you should find the defendant guilty. And when you think about, again, comparing that to Sarah Boone, so what this means for us, like the lens through which the jury viewed the evidence in Sarah Boone was there was no conflict in the evidence. Yep, check. I would agree with that, right? There was not any lacking evidence. Yep, check. All this. So I think this is a great instruction. And just looking back at what North Carolina said here, their footnote was State v. Shaw, North Carolina. So that footnote is just saying this is for the case law here is saying that it only needs to be defined if requested from that case law. But this pattern jury instruction includes the definition. So, okay, so now we're going to take a look at the Massachusetts. Now, okay, so, and we know that there were some changes made to the jury instructions in this case for Karen Reed, but what we're going to be looking at, I think, was exactly what Judge Bev read when it comes to this. So, all right. So for Massachusetts, all right, presumption of innocence. There's a fundamental rule that applies in all criminal cases, including this case. Every person who is accused of a crime is presumed to be innocent of that crime. The defendant is presumed innocent of the charges. That means you must consider the defendant to be innocent unless the prosecution has proved beyond a reasonable doubt through evidence presented during the trial that the defendant committed the crime charged. I will explain what I mean by reasonable doubt in just a moment. And what's interesting in the Florida, where did that go? Florida has a two-prong here, right? They say the state has the burden of proving the crime. In other words, they have the burden that proving the crime happened, and then it's almost separately here, right? And that the defendant is that person. It's like two stages, right? So that also is a distinction between that makes this different from North Carolina and from Massachusetts. So, okay. Okay, the defendant does not have to do anything to convince you he is innocent. He does not have to explain anything. Defendant does not have to testify, call, or okay, so we don't need all that. We can skip that part. Instead, it is up to the Commonwealth to prove the charges against the defendant beyond a reasonable doubt. This burden of proof never shifts to the defendant. After you have considered all the evidence carefully and fairly, if you have a reasonable doubt about the defendant's guilt on the particular charge, then your verdict must be not guilty on that charge. You may find a defendant guilty of a charge only if all 12 deliberating jurors agree that the Commonwealth has proved the charge beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, here's the proof. So the burden is on the Commonwealth to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant is guilty of the charges made against him. What is proof beyond a reasonable doubt? The term is often used and probably and I remember her saying this because I was like, this is interesting. She read this exactly. The term is often used and probably pretty well understood, though it is not easily defined. Proof beyond a reasonable doubt does not mean proof beyond all possible doubt. For everything in the lives of human beings is open to some possible or imaginary doubt. A charge is proof beyond a reasonable doubt if, after you have compared and considered all the evidence you have in your minds, an abiding conviction to a moral certainty that the charge is true. When we refer to moral certainty, we mean the highest degree of certainty possible in matters relating to human affairs based solely on the evidence that has been put before you in this case. I have told you that every person is presumed to be innocent until he or she is proved guilty, and that the burden of proof is on the prosecutor. If you evaluate all the evidence and you still have a reasonable doubt remaining, then the defendant is entitled to the benefit of that doubt and must be acquitted. It is not enough for the Commonwealth to establish a probability, even a strong probability, that the defendant is more likely to be guilty than not guilty. Of course, that's a standard for like civil trials, right? Greater weight of the evidence, or clear and convincing evidence, depending on what is happening in a civil trial. That is not enough. Instead, the evidence must convince you of the defendant's guilt to a reasonable and moral certainty. And again, with the moral certainty, and we're going to talk about this, say it again, moral certainty. A certainty that convinces your understanding and satisfies your reason and judgment as jurors who are sworn to act conscientiously on the evidence. Another interesting word here, conscientiously. That is what we mean by proof beyond a reasonable doubt. So what is different about this one? So they use these terms, abiding conviction to a moral certainty. That's the first time they use the word moral certainty. Then again, second time, when we refer to moral certainties, that's the second time they say moral certainty. And then this description, we mean the highest degree of certainty possible in matters relating to human affairs. And then again, they use it here as well, moral certainty again. A certainty that convinces your understanding and satisfies your reason and judgment as jurors. And the word judgment is interesting too. Why do I say that? Because think back to those jury notes that they sent back, right? Especially the last one, because they made it very clear that it was strongly held personal convictions and beliefs, right? I don't know that they use the word moral, but that is definitely what it sounds like. I wonder if I can find verbatim what that note said. Hold on, let me check real quick. Because, and you know, that was such a big deal. Hold on, let me just see here. Let me, okay, let me just see real quick. All right. Okay, so here we go. We continue to find ourselves at an impasse, the jurors wrote in their final note to the judge. Our perspectives on the evidence are starkly divided. Some members of the jury firmly believe the evidence surpasses the burden of proof, establishing, wait, this isn't the full thing. Hold on. Let me see. Okay, so our perspectives on the evidence are starkly divided. Some members of the jury firmly believe the evidence surpasses the burden of proof, establishing the elements of the charges beyond a reasonable doubt. Conversely, others find the evidence fails to meet the standard as it does not sufficiently establish the necessary elements of the charges. But here's the more interesting part. The deep division is not due to a lack of effort or diligence, but rather a sincere adherence to our individual principles and moral convictions. So they did say the word moral. Holy shit. Our individual principles and moral convictions. To continue to deliberate would be futile and only serve to force us to compromise these deeply held beliefs. So they said these three things stick out to me: individual principles, moral convictions, and deeply held beliefs. Okay. So again, why does this matter? Because the term moral certainty is used 3 times in these jury instructions. And remember, these go back with the jury to deliberate. I wonder how much they read this, because even if it was subconscious, you can see that this influenced, at the very least, their perspectives as indicated in that final note, right? Reasonable moral certainty, a certainty that convinces your understanding and satisfies your reason and judgment. And they even said, they even used the word judgment, or I think in there. Hold on, let me see if I can pull that back up. They said, No, they didn't use the word judgment. They use individual principles. Okay. I mean, which is, again, they're pretty much synonymous, I would say, right? Deeply held beliefs. Again, that you could say that's synonymous with judgment as well. So your reason and judgment, convinces your understanding. So, and again, this part right here, when we refer to moral certainty, we mean the highest degree of certainty possible in matters relating to human affairs, based solely on the evidence, right? So, and we know that they get the part about the evidence, right? That's what's clear in the note. They've considered all the evidence, they said, right? They looked at all the evidence. Some people think the evidence supports the charges, others don't, la, la, la. So it's this second part, right? So there's like the assessing of the evidence, which normally is what is the main, like when you look at the other jury instructions, right? Like, for example, the Florida jury instruction, let me pull that back up, right? This doesn't have this moral burden attached to it. They define reasonable doubt as in a really, I love that. I just love this. They define it in terms of the doubt itself. Like the definition here is focused on the actual doubt and not how the doubt impacts the individual with the doubt or the individual's perspective, right? So this focuses on the doubt itself, not how the person feels, versus here, this focuses on the person's, how the person feels, right? And their individual perspective and their moral convictions. So it's like, so in other words, whereas if you look at the Florida instructions, they can still be focused very more objectively, I feel like, right? With more objective on the evidence, right? And then the definition of the word doubt, those are objective standards, versus here they're being instructed to focus on the, of course, right? They have to base it on the evidence, but there's this added layer that brings in individual, like emotion, really, right? It appeals to each person's personal convictions, which is like the exact languaging used in the jury note. So when looking at, right, what's going on here and why, how is it that with the case that was presented that we saw in trial for Karen Reed, how is it that, she wasn't acquitted? I would say that I think there's a really strong indication that due to the languaging here in these jury instructions, which again is different than other states, that changes things because now you're bringing people's own personal beliefs and moral convictions into the mix. And then that's completely different. And though people's deeply held beliefs, for example, right, their moral convictions, that's a whole set. That has nothing to do with the trial. It's nothing to do with the evidence because people can have those for whatever reason and they're entitled to it, right? But that shouldn't come in at trial, right? That interferes with assessing the evidence, clearly, I would say. All right. So lastly, we're going to take a look at Indiana. And I did actually cover this in a different live stream. I think it was it was a live stream, I'm pretty sure. And we went through all of the Indiana pattern jury instructions because we know that in that trial, Judge Gull actually read those verbatim because they didn't make any changes to the pattern jury instructions. So we went through and read all that. But for anyone who missed it, I wanted to pull it up again and put it into context. So here we go. For anyone who hasn't seen it or did see, when I was scrolling through and reading these jury instructions like live for you guys, and I got to this page, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I was like, where is it? Where is it? Where is it? And then I was like, wait, what? And I was shocked, and I'm still shocked. So how can it get any worse than Massachusetts? I would say here, definition of reasonable doubt, no instruction. All right. Again, the lens through which the jury views the evidence. You've got, we're just to review it, recap it, right? You've got North Carolina. A reasonable doubt is based on reason and common sense, right? So they define it, but it's not too descriptive, right? But at least it's there. It's a doubt based on reason and common sense. Check it out. A doubt based on reason and common sense. Not moral. It's not morals, right? It's not morals. It's not personal beliefs. It's reason and common sense. Again, objective standards, right? Arising out of the evidence, blah, blah. You have to, I mean, this to me seems like at a minimum, this is what we need, right? And then again, looking at Florida, where it's really a great instruction here, and they really define the doubt itself, A reasonable doubt is not a mere problem. We've read all this, but again, you look at that. Then you look at, again, Massachusetts, and they make it all freaking like emotional, right? And bringing in people's personal, deeply held convictions and moral beliefs that they can have for any reason. Again, they're entitled to that, but that should not, in my opinion, be asked of you. I mean, it's like that's something that could happen even if it's not in an instruction. Like it's right. That's why we have voir dire, because that's always a possibility and a concern that people will involve their moral beliefs and personal convictions and shit when they're assessing the evidence and deliberating. Here, it's asked of them to do that, which is wild. It asks you to. It uses moral certainty 3 times, and they use the word moral in that last jury note. And then, again, to me, the only thing that's possibly worse is, where'd it go? Here, no instruction. So again, thinking about Delphi, right? And we looking at the evidence, looking at the case that was presented, looking at all the issues, as I've already mentioned. And all of us were thinking, how the heck could they not acquit him? I mean, not everybody, but again, I really, truly feel like people who thought he was going to be found guilty, they were relying on their moral convictions, right? That's truly what I believe, right? But when the whole thing is about, is there reasonable doubt, right? They know that. They know they have to be that's the standard, that's the burden, that they're given that burden, right? But then when it comes to the definition, no instruction. So it's a free-for-all as to what any particular juror's understanding of reasonable doubt is. It's not defined. And I disagree. So let's look at this. Okay, oops. If we look at jurors know, this is what's from the case of the jurors know what reasonable doubt, sorry, wait, I lost my place here. Reasonable doubt must speak for itself. Jurors know what is reasonable, and are quite familiar with the meaning of doubt. So I would disagree. And why do I say that? Because what we've just looked at, the difference between the other 3 jury instructions, make it quite clear that it is subjective unless it's defined, because those 3 are very different from each other between North Carolina, Florida, and Massachusetts. Completely different. So this, to me, is crazy that they're relying on this. Reasonable doubt must speak for itself. No, clearly not. Clearly not. So, and not to mention, they're relying on federal case law, not Indiana case law, to make this decision. And as we know, as we've seen, right, these jury instructions vary by the state, and their state is like, we're just gonna not have an instruction. So that's why I wanted to look at this, because again, when you look at, did the jury get it wrong? What's going on with the jury? When people are surprised by the jury, for people who watch the Casey Anthony trial and look at that instruction, I think if you actually watch it and you're honest with yourselves, again, it's no surprise that she was acquitted. And there's plenty of people, I would imagine, who still think Casey Anthony is guilty. Again, didn't watch the trial, but would think that Karen Reed and Richard Allen are innocent or not guilty. And I would urge anyone who hasn't watched the Casey Anthony trial, again, I've got a playlist on my channel for it. If you look at that and you apply the Florida jury instruction, and then again, you look at those other 2 cases, Karen Reed, Richard Allen, and then you look at their respective jury instructions, and I think you can see potentially why. Now, the thing that I wanted to know is, like, when you ask if jurors speak out afterwards, and we know that they did, many did in Karen Reed, well, in a way, not like outwardly to the media, but, but when jurors speak out, right? If you were to ask, if let's just say that hypothetically all the jurors speak out, from both Karen Reed and from Richard Allen, right? They're going to describe things, I would imagine, right? Probably in the evidence that convinced them beyond a reasonable doubt. And why do I say that? Because again, these instructions are the lens through which they view it. So, and going back to Massachusetts here, again, that last jury note referenced the elements of the charges, but then that whole second paragraph to it was literally about people's deeply held personal moral convictions, right? And so if you were to ask them, they may or may not even say that, right? Because they would be just saying that it's how they view the evidence. But again, it's the lens through which they view it. That's why this matters. And that's what I wanted to say. Because even when you have a really, shoddy investigation, right? Like taking Karen Read, where there's the red Solo cups, right? Perfect example. How do you get past the red Solo cups? I said that from the get-go. At that point, this thing should be over. With the red Solo, it was really questionable before that. But when you bring in the red Solo cups, this thing should be done. Like, what are we doing, right? And so how do you, when you imagine, well, then how does a jury view the red Solo cups and not be like, this is bullshit, we're quitting her and going home? It's the lens through which they viewed them. Because if they're viewing red Solo cups, but from personal, deeply held beliefs and moral convictions and, shit that's like their personal bias, essentially, right? Then you can view, it changes how you view the red Solo cups. It changes how you view the evidence. And that's my point, is it's the lens through which you view the evidence. So when you're given a very clear lens, like in Florida, or a basic lens, like in North Carolina, versus this lens in Massachusetts, which is encouraging them to incorporate their own personal beliefs, and then no lens in Indiana, I think it makes sense that you can see how that would impact their view of the evidence, right? And I'm saying that because, again, I want to continue to have faith in the jury system. And, I think that with looking at the difference in these jury instructions, I think for me, what I would say is the problem wasn't the jurors in terms of, the verdict they returned or lack thereof in Karen Read's case. I would say the problem is the jury instructions in terms of the results of those two trials resulting in, verdicts or lack thereof that many people were just completely shocked about and upset by. I know, like, many people have expressed after Karen Read, they've just lost faith in the justice system. And then again with Richard Allen. And it's crazy, right? Because it's like they lost with Karen Read. It's like losing faith in the justice system because she wasn't acquitted, but at least it was a mistrial. And then you look at Richard Allen and so, so the point, though, is like what can be done, right? Because if we know that these jurors were paying attention, right? We know, at least in Richard Allen's case, they were taking notes, they were asking lots of questions, stuff like that, right? So it's not, I don't blame the jurors, right? I blame the jury instructions. And the way that is changed is through the legislature, right? Or the legislative branch. They have to make those official changes. Now, of course, they rely on case law, but any change made to the pattern instructions has to come through legislation. So I think it's crazy too, right? That like people's lives are completely impacted in the most serious way. Like, their life is over, essentially, right? Unless something happens on appeal, right? Their life can be over, or they can get their life back. Even if you take cases and you imagine that if you say that take those three cases, right? Casey Anthony and Richard Allen and Karen Read, and let's just say that they'll try to make them as even as possible in terms of the evidence, right? They all have the same quality of evidence. They have the same quality of attorneys on both the state side and the defense side. Everything is like basically the same, right? And they both have a panel of jurors that are fair and they were voir dired and all that, right? And everything is just equal, even playing field. And you take all that and even it out. If you just apply those three different jury instructions between Florida, Massachusetts, and Indiana, you can see how the results in terms of what happens with the jury and the verdicts would be different, even if everything else is the same. And that's the point. That's why this matters. So that's what I wanted to just go over, because I was thinking about it a lot. And honestly, what kind of sparked this idea was I was listening to Mark Betterow on Laura You Know, and he mentioned the part about the moral certainty in the Massachusetts jury instruction, and which I'm sure I'd heard when she read them, right? But I didn't remember that part specifically. And I don't think I had pulled them up. And so, but him mentioning the moral certainty thing, I was like, oh my God, of course. And that's when I was like, holy shit, the moral certainty. Yeah, that makes it different from, and then of course I had already discovered the problem with Indiana on that live stream where it's this problem here. And so I was like, these two states do things differently, very differently with these jury instructions. And that's when I was like, I wonder if that's really what it comes down to, right? Maybe it's not the defendant, maybe it's not the evidence, maybe it's not, maybe it just, again, it's the lens through which you view it. So hopefully that, I would hope that for any of you guys who have lost faith in the justice system and lost faith in juries, right? And if in fact you're one of those people, and let's just say that Casey Anthony is one of those trials that comes to mind when you think about losing faith in the jury, or Karen Reed, or Richard Allen, or all three, I would hope that you go and watch the Casey Anthony trial and then think about what I just presented with these different jury instructions, because I think if you do that, I know for me, it made a big difference, right? Because I'm with you guys. Any of you guys feel like you lost faith in the, like I said, it happened to me, right? But looking at the lens through these jury instructions, it matters. And I can see how it impacted the verdict to where at least for me, I think that we can still hold out hope for the juries, right? But I think that for me, at least, I would lose hope, would be in the legislative branch and the people that are responsible for changing, because the jury instructions are updated like every year, right? The pattern jury instructions. And for them to not make any changes to it, like that's where I feel like a lot of the responsibility lies, not on the jurors. And so I would hope that, for anyone who was really upset and lost faith, hopefully you can see that maybe the jurors weren't the problem, right? Maybe it's the jury instructions. So, yeah. So with that being said, that's what I kind of wanted to go over, and we will have the next episode for Casey Anthony tonight, going over that Orange County Sheriff's Office investigative report. So for anyone who has, is new and to watching my coverage of that and is thinking, yeah, maybe I will go back and watch that trial. This episode is not we're not going to have any trial testimony. We're going to still be looking at this investigative report. So in other words, even if you haven't been watching the trial, you could still join us on that live stream and you wouldn't feel lost or, in other words, because again, it's an episode away from the trial testimony. And then in the following episode, we will resume with the trial testimony. And actually we'll be getting into like the medical examiners and stuff on that episode. So anyway, but that's it for this time, guys. But thanks for watching and for being a squirrel. And I will see you guys next time.